This week, a controversial ex-leader has launched a brand new book. No, not that one, not that one. Guenther Steiner has released his second book. And here it is, Guenther Steiner's Unfiltered. I received this on Friday, and on Saturday I sat down and I read all of it in one sitting. And now the big question I had about this book here, before I read it, is, since I have read this book here, how different is it really? So this is the book that he released last year, about May of last year, Surviving to Drive. And then there is this one that he has released this year, October, called Unfiltered. What are the main differences? Well, firstly, what I would say is if you're on the fence about buying Unfiltered and you're not really sure, here's a really easy flowchart for you. If you have read Surviving to Drive, I would say either don't read Unfiltered or wait until it's on sale and get it then. If you haven't read Surviving to Drive, just read Unfiltered. Don't read Surviving to Drive, because there is a lot of crossover between these two books. They're both about 320 pages each, and they both cover very similar things despite being in very different formats. Now this one here, Surviving to Drive, is basically like a diary. So each entry is a different day, and he kind of talks about what's happened in that day. And it's a great way to do kind of a season retrospective, because it gives you as the reader kind of an advanced knowledge over Guenther as the writer, because you know what's coming on later in the season and he doesn't. So this is very reactionary, very day-to-day thing. Whereas Unfiltered is more of that autobiographical style that just kind of goes, oh, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. You know, but they do cover a lot of the same ground, because in Surviving to Drive, he does reminisce about certain stories about how Haas was made, and, you know, the first season that they had, and, you know, the Grosjean crash, and Rich Energy, and all that kind of stuff. So, a lot of the same stuff gets covered in both. So, if you only want to read one, read Unfiltered. If you're on the fence and you've read Surviving to Drive, I would not recommend picking up Unfiltered. But the main thing I have to say, which is a difference, apart from the fact that the two are formatted in a different way, is that when he wrote Surviving to Drive, he was still part of the Haas team, whereas when he writes Unfiltered, he is not. So that is why it is called Unfiltered, because you can tell now, if you are one of the people like me who has read both of his books, that certain stories are told again in a different way, because now he no longer has to report back to the team, which I think is very interesting, and we'll get into that in a little bit more. But yeah, it's giving more detail and more kind of opinion on certain people, certain things, all that kind of stuff. That's more in Unfiltered than it was in Surviving to Drive. Also, at the end of Unfiltered, he says, oh, one day I might write an autobiography. That's what this is. So this book is an autobiography. It says here it's my incredible decade in Formula One. So basically, this book focuses entirely on his life within Formula One, and I think the argument he would make is an autobiography would be his entire life. But I think of all like the headline moments, they're covered in here. I'm sure he has wonderful stories about, you know, his time in rally or NASCAR. I mean, he doesn't talk much about his time in Jaguar, that Formula One area. Basically, this is a book of Haas. This is all his Haas life. So I'm sure there are plenty of other stories that will be very interesting, but this is basically the Guenther Steiner autobiography, even if that's not what he wants to call it. That's what it is. So let's start with the start, and even before the book, we get a foreword. Now, in the first book, it was Stefano Domenicali, who wrote a beautiful foreword talking about how great Guenther is as a person and a team principal. For this one, the foreword is written by Toto Wolff, and it is a 2-page roast of Guenther Steiner before you read his book, which is very interesting to hear. Also, you know, there's a few more details on the start of Haas, but it's the exact same story as in Surviving to Drive, because the story hasn't changed. The only thing that I learned new about the launch of Haas in this one compared to the other book was that they initially went for Nico Hulkenberg and they were going to sign him, but at the last minute Hulk decided he wanted to stay with Force India rather than move to Haas. And also there was discussions of bringing in Kevin Magnussen at the start, but they decided that they thought he was too young at that time to be part of the team and too inexperienced. So the two drivers that Guenther ends Haas with were the two drivers that realistically he wanted to start with. So that's kind of interesting. But let's get into the juicy stuff and the controversies and the many controversies that followed Guenther round during his Haas time, starting with Rich Energy. Now, Rich Energy does get talked about in the first book, but like I said, I feel he's a bit more free here to say what he really feels. And my God, he is not a fan of William Story, the head of Rich Energy. He also comes out and says that Rich Energy was supposed to sponsor Williams. Apparently, they were supposed to be the title sponsor of Williams, and William Story had a dinner reserved with Claire Williams at the time, but didn't go to the dinner and kind of just left her there because he was discussing stuff with Haas. And Williams ended up going with Rocket, who I believe ended up suing them. So bad business all round for Williams and Haas from that point of view. He also revealed that Rich Energy were one of the proposed buyers for Force India when that went up, but the people behind Force India didn't think they were a serious contender and ignored them, and of course that went on to be sold to Lawrence Stroll. So good bit of business there from Force India in the end. And Guenther also talked about how William Story has said that he guaranteed Haas $35 million, whereas Guenther doesn't believe that William Story had $35, never mind $35 million. The other big controversy, of course, is Uralkali and the Mazepins. And my God, the leash is off when it comes to those two, because of course that's a huge section of the first book, because it looks at the season of 2022, which is when you have the whole Mazepin thing where he has to be fired because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's the start of the book when they bring back Magnussen and all that kind of stuff. So he's telling that story again, but now from the point of view of someone who no longer works from the company, and my God, you can tell it, because I don't think it was mentioned in the first book, but in the second book he mentions the whole thing about Nikita Mazepin being an idiot and posting a video of him groping a woman onto social media. He actually discusses that in this book, and not only does he discuss it, in relation to it, he calls Nikita Mazepin a Russian sex pest. So, you know, the handbrake's off when it comes to this, and the book's called Unfiltered, and that was a rather unfiltered way to describe Nikita Mazepin. Of course, a new thing within this book that wasn't in the first one is him getting fired, because it hadn't happened in the first book. But before we get on to that, just a couple other things that I think were of note that I wanted to discuss. He says in here that before the 2020 season started officially, both Grosjean and Magnussen knew that they weren't going to be renewed by Haas. He had told them. Now, of course, with the 2020 season, it was supposed to start in that Australia race that got cancelled. Then there was a whole long time during the whole COVID stuff when nothing was happening, and then the season happened itself. They didn't know before they went to Australia, but they were told in that gap with COVID before they officially started the season. So they were fully aware of what was happening long before they actually had a proper race that season. I don't think that was mentioned in the first book. I thought that was kind of interesting. But let's get on to Guenther being fired. And this is another thing where you can tell he's no longer working for the company, because the way he talks about Gene Haas in this book is very different. Now, I don't necessarily remember him being massively negative about Gene in the first book. Gene's kind of just this character in the first book who is ever present. He's the money guy, you know? He's the guy who he reports back to all the time if results are going badly. Whereas in this book, you really see the deterioration of the relationship between Guenther and Jean. And you see at the start of their relationship, Jean is this guy who, he's not the most charismatic, energetic guy in the world, but he's interested and he's invested and he's behind the team and he backs the team. But as the season goes on and goes on and goes on, Jean seems to pull further and further away and wants to invest less and less and less. And Guenther correlates that with the team's lack of success as the seasons go on. Where the 2023 season seems like quite a bad time for Guenther in general. He describes at one point saying that his sole aim of 2023 was just to shut Jean up, because of course he was complaining of bad results but was refusing to invest. So Guenther was working so hard to get whatever they had to work just to shut him up, and unfortunately he couldn't do that. And he says once the checkered flag went down in Abu Dhabi, he just felt despondent, and the determination that he once had within the team had just disappeared. So it sounds to me, despite the fact that he was let go by Haas, if he had stayed on, I don't think he would have stayed on for too long, because it sounds like the love and the passion that he had for the team had been destroyed by the time that it was time for him to leave. And then we get to the part where he learns that he is going to leave. And he says it takes place, I think it was the 28th of December, 2023. He says he's in the supermarket looking at a big slice of ham and his phone rings. Apparently him and Jean had a phone call that lasted around about 7 minutes and included 2 separate arguments. The first argument being Guenther telling Jean that he needs to invest more within the team, and Jean saying no. Then the second argument being, well, if you're not going to invest more in the team, you need to sell this team to someone who will, otherwise we're going to go nowhere, and Jean says no. This is followed by Jean telling Guenther that his contract will not be renewed and he's been let go. And then Guenther goes on to say about how he wasn't really depressed in a way. It didn't let him down. It sounds to me like either he's spinning this or it's true. You can take whatever view you feel is appropriate. But it kind of makes it feel like him being let go at the end of this kind of helped him, because he wasn't in a great place with it as it was. And he's now able to do other things like this book or the tour that he's doing or the punditry or the podcasts or whatever it might be. He says he has a hotel that he's opened as well in Italy, so he goes on to list all his other projects that he's doing, and of course spending some more time with his family as well. But yeah, it wasn't the greatest ending to that relationship, and it does sound like that relationship is now dead since Guenther has left. I don't know if he actually has spoken to him or not, but yeah, it's very insightful into the end there. There's not too much on the 2023 season, which is quite surprising. He talks a lot about how that they just couldn't get the tyre degradation right, but there was a few highs I felt for them within the season, especially in terms of qualifying, and I would have liked to hear a little bit more about his relationship with Nico Hülkenberg. Nico Hülkenberg does not really get much of a mention within the book. They say, of course, they wanted to sign him early on, but apart from that, there isn't too much said about him. One great quote, though, early on in the book, I can't even remember what this is in relation to, but Guenther Steiner says, "I was like Nico Hülkenberg in a mirror factory. I was incredibly excited," which is a great line to have there from Guenther. So there you go. That is my thoughts on this book. Again, it's very, very good, and that's what I said about this one, about Surviving to Drive. Stupid title, good book. See, they're both very good, but don't read both of them. Read one or the other. Don't be like me, who has read the same book twice with different covers and a different ending. Pick one. They're both very good books separately. I don't think they both need to exist in the same time frame. And if he writes a third one, I'm sure I'll read that one as well. But overall, yeah, very, very good. If you haven't read the other one, I definitely recommend picking up this book. So there you go. That's Stop and Go F1 Book Club. We'll be back next time there's a book. Oh, I can't wait. I'll see you then. Goodbye.